please.
Okay, so welcome everyone to Cortland County Historical Society. My name is Tabitha Scoble. I'm the assistant director here. And I asked Tom Kanalley to come and do a presentation. I know he collects stoneware as well, but he suggested fishing tackle, which I thought was something interesting. So I would like to introduce Tom Kanalley, and thank you for coming. Next week too, we do have Peg Ross, the historian from Greene. She'll be talking about the Civilian Conservation Corps in Shenango County. And one other thing, if you have a cell phone on you, please silence that so it doesn't go off during the presentation. Thank you.
Well, I thought this was appropriate because Monday was opening day of trout season. So sometimes there's more interest in fishing tackle and so on. But I want to thank Tabitha and the board here at the Historical Society for inviting me to talk, and it's very kind of you people come out in the middle of the week like this. Give you a little background on me, I guess. I grew up just a little bit to the west on an old dairy farm, and I don't know why, but I just always loved to fish all the time. And I used to sneak off down to the creek on the family farm, and I think when I was 7, I caught like a brook trout. I know it was 8 1/4 inches, and I think that's what did it to me. I got hooked on that, and so then I would spend all my money on fishing tackle. You know, we get bottles and things and take deposits, and that's where all my money went to. And so I decided that I wanted to be a fisheries biologist, so I went to Cornell, and I did that, and I worked for the conservation department here in Homer for a short time, up in the salmon program up in Pulaski, and then I ended up at Cortland Fish Line for 30 years. So that was fun. I really enjoyed that a lot, and I'm right in the middle of the fishing history, I guess you'd say. I want to tell you something that happened a while back here. I was ice fishing with my friends on Wasco Lake, and you cut holes in the ice, and you put up tip-ups, these things with flags, and you got to hit the flag, goes up. And you get 5 tip-ups, and you get 2 hand lines. And my friend Jay was out in the lake catching, checking his minnows on his tip-ups, and my friend George, this real dry sense of humor, Jay comes back, and George says, Jay, I think you had a hit. And Jay says, well, how do you know? He says, well, your rod went down the hole. So I thought that was pretty good. This is a very large subject. I probably should have just segmented it. So I'm going to just give you some basic history and go through it real quick. And then we're going to just do some show and tell and take questions and so on. But central New York and upstate New York was so pivotal in all this fishing tackle. I'll show you some of that here in a minute. I think I want to just cover the social part of fishing initially. Early on it was subsistence. You'd go fishing to catch a fish to eat or something like that. And I read accounts over in like Lock where the fish would be running and they would take a horse and wagon and they would pitchfork the fish into the back of the wagon in the early 1800s. And they would use the fish for fertilizer because they were just so plentiful. And I read another account where DeWitt Clinton was surveying where the Erie Canal was going to be. And he was up at Fish Creek near Oneida Lake, and they tried to cross, and the fish were knocking the horses down. There were Atlantic salmon, ocean run, and there were so many fish they knocked the horses down. And so it was really quite a different time back then. They used to have, the wealthy people used to have angling clubs, like the Angling Club of New York City, which is still there today. Leon Chandler was a member, if you know who he was. And in Philadelphia, they had angling clubs and so on. And you had to be wealthy to have the time and to have the inclination to go fishing. Most of this fishing tackle is extremely expensive, and most people had to work. So what they do in the summertime is they get an expedition together, and there'd be a dozen or so people, and they catch the train and take it to the Adirondacks, and they just drop them out in the middle of nowhere. And all the tackle and food for a month, but there'd be at least as much alcohol too. And it seemed to be a big part of the fishing back then. Another thing that's important is down the Delaware River, down near Roscoe, the Willowweemock and so on. That's considered the cradle of fly fishing for the whole United States. That's where they did a lot of innovations and things were really sparked, and that's really not too far from us. In fact, down there they have the Catskill Fly Fishing Museum down in Livingston Manor, and that's really worth a trip. It's a lot of fun. And I know Cortland Line donated a lot of money to help them in the early days. But there was a gentleman down there named Lee Wolf, and he was kind of a contemporary. He's been gone a while. but he invented the fishing vest in the 1930s, which people never had before. And you see these all the time now. People use them for camera and so on. And he invented that, and he came up with the idea. He said a fish is too important to catch only once, and he started getting people to catch and release. In the European tradition, if you went out fishing, you went out to kill a fish. I mean, you went to kill a fish, not catch a fish. And so that was all done here in our backyard. So I think that's kind of important. So fishing tackle encompasses a lot of things like the hook, the line, the rod, the reel. So I'm just going to give you some real quick history on all these different things. Like old fishing hooks. They found the fishing hooks here that are like 9,000 years old. And that's not them, but you can find a book on almost anything. This is a book just on fishing hooks. And let's see what I can find here. Here's some of the old fishing hooks that they dug up in the Middle East. And mostly they were made out of bone or things like, that's all that's really survived. And they even have Bronze Age drawings of the old hooks and so on that people were using. You zip up to like the 1400s, and of course back then you had to make all your own tackle. You had to make your own rod, you had to make your own line, you had to make your own fish hooks. So what they'd do is take needles for sewing, and they would heat them up and make their fish hooks. Like people like Isaac Walton you've heard of, and well, I hope you've heard of. And this is Dame Juliana Berners. She was a nun, and she was a big fly fishing person. And so she tells how to make fishing hooks and how to make line and so on. But this is, I think her book was 1496. So that's pretty early right there. The first production hooks that were made for people didn't start until 1877. Up until then, you had to make all your own hooks. And they started making those in England, and they would just bend them around to form, kind of. They didn't have any eyes on the hooks to tie your line to. You had to lash them on every hook. And things have progressed from there. This is a card of hooks that were made in Auburn, New York, back in the 30s. And this is Bill DeWitt, and he did fishing tackle and so on. But it proudly says "Made in USA," which is kind of nice. And then later on, the Mustad Hook Company moved to Auburn, New York, and they were there for about 2 decades. And they moved down in the meantime. But there's a few hooks. And in case you want to catch something really big, here's a nice one. And this was one supposedly designed by Zane Grey. He was an author who wrote like the New Riders of the Purple Sage and all the cowboy things. Well, he was a huge fisherman. And once he was successful, he just traveled the world in this great big boat and fished all day long. And saltwater, he's very famous for that. So that takes care of the hooks. So if you're going to have a hook, you need a fishing line. And back in the old days, of course, they used natural fibers, maybe linen or cotton. And a big thing back then was horsehair. They used to look for a white stallion, and they would pluck the hairs off, and they would twist them and tie knots, and then do links like that. And you couldn't use mirrors and things like that because the hair was too brittle. But way back when, the Chinese were using silk, but I don't think it was in the West back then. But you either twist a line or braid it. And our connection here is the Gladding Line Company in South Osceola, New York, who's still in business, and another iteration, kind of. But they came to Versailles in 1816. And so 2016 was their 200-year anniversary for Gladding Fish Line, which I think is fantastic. But what he did when he moved there in 1816, first thing the family did is they built a rope walk. And it'd be like it was like a dirt floor, but it was all enclosed, and you would twist and braid the line 100 feet long and slide it down and tighten it down. And They would use hemp, they make rope, of course, but they use flax and cotton, different things like that. And if you worked 6 days a week, 16 hours a day, you get $3 a week. And it sounds like hard work to me. But they're the key to all the fish line companies in central New York. They provided the expertise. Companies like the Newton Line Company. This is the Newton Line right here. They started business in 1909, and it was kind of, again, came from Gladding. Cortland Line, they started in 1915, and they hired some people away from Gladding. That's how they started. Here's the Marathon Line Company. They were in Marathon for a couple of years. And you can trace it even to Cortland Cable Company here in town. Cortland Cable is a spin-off of Cortland Line, and they wouldn't be here if Gladding hadn't started Cortland Line, basically. But these old lines, like silk lines and so on, you had to be real careful. They would rot or they could spoil. If you fished all day with a line like that, you'd have to dry it out. They'd put it in the trees and stuff and let it dry out, because if you put it away wet, it would rot, and you'd catch a fish and it would just pop the line. And then they would use like silk gut. You'd take a silkworm and they'd pull the center of the silk to make a leader. And that was really stiff. Now you had to soak that all night to get it so it would flex. So you dry one and you soak the other. But and then they had what's called cutty hunk. And if I can find one here. But it's really linen is what it is. And that was used for salt water because that wouldn't rot. And flax or linen, and it would come, a lot of it would come from like Ireland and so on. And you can only twist linen because if you braid it, it'll break. So there was a lot to it with these natural fibers and so on. So then, starting about World War II, they invented a whole bunch of synthetic lines like rayon, dacron, and especially nylon for fish line. And that pretty much changed everything. You didn't have to care for the lines, and they were very strong and they were kind of transparent. And so things kind of exploded. A lot more fishermen back then, they could afford to fish. And then they came up with plastic lines, like this Newton line right here, where you put a PVC coating on a line, and it would float for fly fishing, for instance. Cortland Line in 1953 invented the first successful floating fly line, synthetic. And it was like a hollow braid, and they would taper it and put a vinyl coating on it. And their sales thing was to take a peanut butter can full of water and put the line in it and show people it just floated. They just leave it on the counter like for weeks. In 1953, I think within a couple of weeks they sold their whole inventory of line for the next year, because it was such a renovation, because everyone was using silk and having to do all these things and clean their line. And by about 1955, they had more than half the U.S. market in fly lines right here from Cortland. It was that short a time. Now, in the meantime, Gladding Corporation here was working on fly fishing line too. And the Cortland lines, you had to braid a taper in the line, then they coat it. And a woman could do 8 lines a day in a like an 8-hour shift. And Gladding came up with the idea of tapering the plastic, not the line. And they hired some consultants, and they made plastic line with microscopic glass beads in it to make the line float, and that's took over the market, and that's still how they make fly lines today. It's kind of complicated, but and things are still progressing all the time. They came up with from the nylon to fluorocarbon fishing line, and it's kind of more dense, and its refractive index is such that you can't see it in water very well. And I know the Berkeley company, they approached Albany International to see if they could make a fluorocarbon fishing line for them. And on their first try, they got it right. And they made the line and did all the research right here in Homer for one of the biggest fish line companies in the world. So that was right in our backyard too. And then the next innovation was they came out with long chain polyethylene, which is like a a black garbage bag, but it's an extremely long chain. And it's a braid, and it's called, people call it spider wire, things like that. And so we would braid that up, or Gladding would braid that up, and it's 10 times stronger per diameter than stainless steel, and it floats. And that's where fishing is today. Pretty incredible. So that kind of covers the fishing lines. Next thing are the fishing rods. And they don't really know, how far back it goes until they find like a picture or a drawing. But they've got evidence of fishing rods from 2000 BC in China and Greece, Rome, England. But then getting back to Dame Juliana Berners, this is like the first big fishing book, so you knew what was going on back then. And back then they started using like 15-foot rods or 16-foot rods, like even longer than that. And they would hold it, it'd be work kind of to hold a fishing rod out like that. But they were all solid wood back then. And you kind of just tie a line on the end and you just kind of dap it, as they say. They wouldn't cast or anything like that, they just kind of throw it out there. And the beauty of a rod like that, if you get like a really big fish or a really big salmon, you think it's going to break your line, you just throw the rod in the water. And the fish will pull the rod around, and when he tires out, you grab the rod and you go and play him again. And if he's still too big, you just throw the rod in the water again. But, it sounds like fun, actually.
You're right.
But then they came up with like bamboo rods, and this is a bamboo rod here. It's like 6-sided, and it came from mostly China. Bamboo cane, and these rods are really strong and really flexible, and they kind of changed the whole landscape. And there were even bamboo rod makers, these hobby ones in Cortland. So it's very difficult to make these. You have to taper all the bamboo, and you have to see where the nodes are so you don't get a weak spot. And there's a lot to it. So the next innovation was a solid fiberglass, and you couldn't break those. They were just strong as could be. And there were solid metal rods too, around 1900, quite a few. Then they came up with the innovation of hollow fiberglass rods, and that's kind of what you see today. Somewhat they bend and they're lightweight and so on. And you'd make a metal mandrel and you'd wrap the fiberglass around it and you'd bake it with resin, and that's how the first rods came out. Then the next step up, they came up with like airplane grade graphite and some boron, and then they upgraded that to high density graphite, and they're the rods you see today for the most part, are graphite rods. But there's a lot of different rods for different uses and different reasons, and I only brought a few here today. Here's the tip here. This is a rod from right around the Civil War, the end of the Civil War. And as you can see, they call it a pool cue type fishing rod, us fishermen do. And this thing's quite heavy. It's probably hickory. And if I put the tip on, it's even further. But this is the short one. So,
Wow.
Isn't that fun? I think it's fun. Anyways. And then this is a fly rod that was custom made for Cortland line here in town. And like old bamboo rods, they're collectibles, and we consider them artwork. And as a rule, the shorter they are, the more they're worth. This is a 7-footer. And they're just beautiful things, and they're just kind of hypnotic. But they're very different from the new rods today. They're very fast action, they call it, very responsive. But here's a picture of some old tackle here, and this rod's in that photograph. And so I'll set that down here. Okay, next we jump to fishing reels, and there was a lot to that. And the first fishing reels were about 1200 AD, course, in China was very progressive. In England, the first ad is from 1651 and talks about a wind, where you wind your line. Now these aren't reels that you cast or anything, they just held the line and you could pull it out and let a little bit more out, but it was just to hold the line. And I might have something here. And this one's not nearly that old, but this one you just clamp around your rod, and because they hadn't come up with the idea of a reel, feet, things like that. But that's a real old one there. And then the big innovation about 1820 is they came up with multipliers. And in England and America, we're kind of on equal footing. This is called a Kentucky reel, and these started in the U.S. about 1820. This one's not that old, but for every turn of the handle, it might turn 3 times inside. And so if you're playing a fish, you can keep the line tight and not lose the fish. And that was a huge innovation. And almost always was jewelers that made these type things because of the precision. It had to be really well made. And of course, collectors go crazy for them. Another innovation was, let me come over here. Was up in Rochester, New York. A gunsmith named Billinghurst came up with this is the first American fly reel, basically. And it's called a birdcage reel. And the reason for the birdcage is so the line would dry out. I was telling you about, so the line wouldn't rot. And and it's a side mount. They couldn't make up their mind whether to put the reel seat here, like today, or on the side. So they just put it on the side. And it's kind of like I've got an old gun home. They couldn't decide whether to put the firing pin on the gun or on the shells. And this gun, every shell has a firing pin on it, every bullet. Or believe it or not, one time they're trying to decide whether to put rubber on tires or rubber on roads. Well, but this is the same thing. That's how they did it. So it's called a side mount reel, but it's from 1859. And it was a big innovation, especially for America.
Where did you find that, Tom?
It came out of Skinny Atlas.
Yeah.
Yeah. And here's a smaller one. This one came out of Sempronius, of all places. Yep. So, I don't know, I'm kind of partial to those. I just think they're a lot of fun, and you never see them. Here's another one from Rochester. They decided to just stamp them out and save money. It's called a Fowler reel. This is one from Connecticut, but there's only a couple of these known. But doesn't it have that old look to it? It just doesn't look that refined yet. And this is one from Ilion, New York, where like Remington gun is today. This is called a Pettingill, and you can see they started putting it on the top there. But this reel is about 1887 still. At least the patent is. So it's kind of fun. And then around 1900, there was so much mass production they could make a bunch of different things. And this is called an automatic fly reel, and it has like a clock spring in it, and as the line goes out, it tightens the spring, and you just push this arm and it just comes right back in. And this was invented in Syracuse, New York, a company called Morehouse. And then I'm trying to think of the other company up there. But 2 different companies made these in Syracuse, and finally a company called Yaman and Irby out of Rochester kind of took over the market, and that's what this one is. Yeah. But that's kind of a dead end. It was kind of hot for a while. People really don't use them much anymore because they're kind of heavyweight. And then here's a CG graphite reel. This was the first commercial lightweight graphite reel in the world. And this was made and manufactured in Cortland, New York. And this is it's really, really lightweight. We worked with Pete Scala out of Cornell. And I remember these are literally made right on 67 East Court Street. And it's a great design, at least the small ones, and they're lightweight and they're fun, and it's got a pulse system. But Cortland line always had problems. We made things too early. People weren't ready for it. And back then they said it's plastic. We don't want anything that's plastic. You know, and since it's plastic, we had a hard time selling it. But today they make a lot of fly reels just like that. But that all started right here in Cortland. So it's kind of nice. And then there's been variations like spin cast reels where you just push a button and cast and so on. It's kind of a knockoff of a spinning reel. So these are bait casting reels, and they'd use the old braided line. It has a spinning core there. And so World War II, all the GIs were exposed to fishing over in Europe, and what they were doing, they were using a fixed spool, a spinning reel here. And when they came home, they wanted spinning reels because you could use lighter line, you could use lighter lures. And so then after World War II, kind of spinning reels took over most of the market. And there's been some changes. They're still using some bait casting reels for bass fishing and so on, but this is the major part of the market now. So now we get to the fun part, we get to the fishing lures. And I think that's a lot of fun. If I can find my notes. Nope, I just can't. Oh, it's right in front of my face. In the early days, they used hand lines a lot with a hook and bait, things like that. And a lot of lures are just made of bone, and you see these sometimes, and sometimes we think it's Inuits, but I think it could have been almost anywhere. And they used to pound bronze, and they'd use that for lures, and they would jig and things with a hand line. And I noticed down in South America, they still fish like that today. I was down in Belize a while back, and they had these little dugout, I call it like bathtub. I don't know how they balance those things. They'll be there with a hand line, throwing them out and doing exactly what was done like 2,000, actually 4,000 years ago, 2000 BC. Later on, when they used to usually use bait and things, they would pull it behind a boat, and they started to fish that way. But the critical mass was about 1850. And again, the Industrial Revolution was kicking in. They could make large quantities of different lures and so on. And they came up with, in England, called a divan minnow. And it has like 2 ears on the front, looks like a little minnow, and it spins like crazy. And that was one of the first major lures. And it would really twist your line, and it would break your line after a while. You'd get all sorts of bird nests and things. But then they came up with the fishing spoon. And I want to read you a little clip here. Even though we're making them in England probably, but here in the U.S. there was a guy named Julio Buell, and he invented the fishing spoon. It literally is a spoon that he was eating with. And let's see if I can find. Actually, I've got his words here somewhere. Let's see if I can find it. Oh, maybe I can't find it. Well, anyways, he was fishing in Vermont, and he was eating his lunch, and they hit a rock with a boat, and his spoon went flying over the side. And he looked down, and a great big trout hit the spoon. It was sterling silver, and I don't think his mother was too happy. But so he got the idea to make a fishing spoon, and so that's literally it right there. And you can see he just soldered a hook on the end of it. And that seemed to work really well. He sold a lot of lures and things like that. This is a different one, but this is a Buell arrowhead spinner right here. And all this was happening up in Whitehall, New York, in upstate New York. See, again, the New York connection. And then they came up with all sorts of spinners and things like that. I mean, they weren't shy with the hooks back then. I think the fish weren't very sophisticated. Those are nasty. And this is an old spinner, a man spinner from Syracuse, New York. And it's no surprise he was a gunsmith too. And there seems to be a connection between jewelers and gunsmiths with all this old fishing tackle. But anyways, the first wooden lure in the United States was, this is a Bush's spinner spoon, you might say, from Bushmill, New York. And Bushmill, New York is so small I can't find it. I think it's downstate, but I don't really know. Anybody know where that is? I mean, if it's not on the internet, I mean, it's really good.
Can't go.
Yeah. But the folklore goes in this direction. A guy named James Hedden, he was a beekeeper, and he was sitting at the camp one day, and like he did back then, you'd whittle wood, I don't know, for the fun of it, I guess. And he threw the stick in the water, a great big fish came up and hit it, and he got all excited, and so he started making these for his friends. He made these frog lures, and he'd carve them out of broomsticks. And these are I mean, there's maybe a dozen of these out there, real ones. And at auction today, these bring $30,000. Yeah. And Hedden is probably the biggest name in fishing lures ever since then. Oh yeah, I don't have them. That's for sure. Let's see what else we got here. So I know, like when my father was young, he hired out for the summer to a guy in Black Rock near Aurora, New York, and his whole thing all summer long was pounding out spoons and things like that. They'd have these molds, and you put them together and pound it together. And back then, you could charge like $1 a spoon. Well, $1 was a day's work. So every little town had spoons, a lot of things like that. Like here's one from Cortland, New York, a jeweler, J.C. Gray. I'm not sure how good he was, but there it is. Here's the Ithaca spoons. There was a lot of Ithaca spoons. And here's some from Cortland, New York. These were made by the Snyders that owned the sporting goods store back in like 1946. So they made spoons. They were really good for lake trout and other type of trout. It's called a flutter spoon. They're real lightweight and they flutter. Well, they were invented on Canandaigua Lake, and no one else had ever done that before. And these flutter spoons are still what they use today when you're downrigging and so on. And that was invented right here in Canandaigua. I mean, everything seems to have a connection to central New York, if you really look at it. But everyone was trying to make a better lure all the time, it seemed like. So when it comes to collecting lures, there's 5 major companies, and a lot of people specialize. There's Hedden Lures, which I told you about, with the frog there. One called Shakespeare. This is a Shakespeare mouse. And Shakespeare's in Kalamazoo. Hedden is in Dowagiac, Michigan. South Bend, initially it was in South Bend, Indiana. And they were bought by Gladden Corporation in the 70s, and they moved to South Osceola. And they owned and ran the South Bend fishing lures. And here's a prototype that they made here in South Osceola. May not have seen the light of day, but they did different prototypes. And I was fortunate enough to find that one at an auction from an old employee. And I think it would scare the heck out of the fish, but that's another story. I don't know, I think, if you have any questions, feel free to ask, and I'll just show you some different things that are here. Here's an old lure from Madrid, New York. Which is up near Messina and Plattsburgh, up that way near the St. Lawrence River. And this guy was a watchmaker and watch repair guy. And in his spare time he made these lures, and he hand painted a whole bunch of these. This little one is the automatic minnow. And when you pull it through the water, the tail will turn and the fins will move back and forth. And they were trying different things back then. But I was able to get most of this from an old collection. And as a collector, this is the only box they've ever found for that lure, so that's pretty exciting. This will be up here later if you want to look at it. We're going through some different ones here. Here's a Detroit minnow cage. And the whole idea is you'd sneak a minnow in the middle here, and you could fish with it all day because the fish would hit it. You would lose the minnow. And, so that's a little different.
Well, traumatized at the end of the day, wouldn't it be?
Yeah, I think he would be. And this is just one everybody just loves. This is more like art. This is a head and pumpkin seed, but they're just fun. I never fished one, so I don't know how good they are.
Well, they catch fishermen.
There's some truth to that.
How do you get
How to catch a fisherman. but with lures, you're really catching the fisherman, not the fish first off.
A lot of those old lures, you get that white powdery
Yeah,
stuff on 'em.
especially the plastic lures. It's the plastic breaking down. It's the plasticizer coming out. And usually, if there's very much of that, they'll start shrinking and shriveling and cracking. Some people take hardener. I'm trying to think of two-part glue there.
Epoxy.
And yeah, epoxy, and they'll take the hardener and you kind of coat it once a year to keep it from doing that. But the real early plastics are unstable. That's what the problem is.
Shrinking right down.
Well, most of them. Some of them you can save. This is a Welch and Graves glass minnow tube from Natural Bridge, New York, of course. And same idea, you pull the cork out, you put the minnow in there and it would magnify it too. And the fish would come and hit that and you could fish with one minnow all day long, in theory. And, but I keep saying, you cast this out and you hit a rock and I think you're done for the day. So. But it's really fun and it's got the original wooden box. And wooden boxes are very desirable for collectors. Again, there's so many odds and ends here. This is an old professional casting weight. It says ACA approved, American Casting Association. And back around the 30s, the 20s and 30s, they used to have, every town had a casting club. And Leon Chandler, who lived in Homer, he won a lot of championships. And they still have like a casting club in San Francisco and some different places. And they cast for distance and they cast for accuracy, and it's quite a competition. And so this is an approved casting weight. You don't see those too often. And this is probably the best thing I have. This is the Miller's reversible minnow. And it's reversible because the spinners turn different ways when you pull it. And it's a floating lure for bass and pike. And it's about 1916, I think, from Union Springs, New York on Cuba Lake, near Aurora, kind of. And he wasn't in business too long. But for collectors, this is one of the pieces you really, really like. And you gotta admit it's different, it's really different. This is called the American Spinner, and a guy named McHarg from Utica, he came up with the idea of the ball. And the ball keeps the spinner in place, and that was a huge innovation at the time, probably in the 1870s. There's some different lures here, but whenever you see a bead that's pivoted on, it's all based on his patent. And most lures are like that today, and that was Utica. Here's a Fluger spoon, again for lake trout. This is a Cuga Lake spoon. It's made specifically for Cuga Lake. I thought that was kind of fun. Yeah. Here's an old fish decoy, and you drop this down the hole, and you lure the fish. They'd circle, and you spear them. Well, like in Skinny Ellis Lake, they outlawed that in 1850. You couldn't spear the fish anymore. But they still do this out in like Wisconsin and Minnesota, and they lure the fish in and they spear them. And these are all hand carved, like folk art, and they're very, very collectible. But like a lot of things, they're being reproduced a lot. This is a creek chub pikey, and you got to fish bigger than this, of course. A lot of people use those for muskies in the St. Lawrence or Chautauqua Lake, and I just think they're a lot of fun. I don't know, be awful hard to cast them and get control of them. This is a Heddon Zyra spook. This is a plastic lure. These other ones are pretty much wood. But they came up with the first plastic lures, and it's almost transparent. And this one's stable. The newer ones don't powder like you were talking about. And this one, you put it on top of the water and you kind of lift the head and they call it walk the dog. And I know it drives barracudas crazy when you do that. Well, that's what this is for bass fishing, actually. Here's a creek chub beetle. You can see where the name came from, and definitely caught the fishermen with this one. I think that's what that was about. This is a creek chub jigger, and it's got a little trough there, and you pull it and it shoots water way up in the air. It makes a big splash, and the fish thinks that something hit, and they come to see what's going on, and then they get competitive. Here. This is the Chippewa, and this spins in the center. And I don't know, I know they sold a lot of them, that's all I know. So that's kind of cool. Well, there's just a lot of different, did I show you this one, the spinning globe? This is a fluke spinning globe, and you put it in the water, it just makes a froth kind of. And then if you get a big fish, it has like a shock absorber in it. which I think is kind of funny. This was a company up in Syracuse called Rush Tango, and this is called the Trout Tango. And this has the World War I victory finish on it. And so again, us collectors get very excited, but this is their victory finish, like 1918 or 1919, whatever. Isn't that fun? And they were all hand painted, and they're all kind of unique in a way. They do modeling and so on.
What makes it the victory finish?
Well, that's what
just
they
the
call
colors,
it.
or?
Well, that's what they called it. They
Huh?
designed it. Some of them are red, white, and blue. Some are,
Okay.
yeah, that was their marketing.
Okay.
That's all I can tell you. But there's a lot going on here. I mean, a lot of these spinners are from the 1850s and 1870s. If you can look at them, they probably can hold them up here. But,
Tom, what is that glass bottle? Maybe you talked about it while I was out of the room.
actually, I didn't know. Right here?
No,
No,
for
right
Right.
in front of you. What is that?
What do you think it is?
Is it for minnows, maybe?
It is.
Okay.
It's a real early minnow trap, real
Okay.
early. And you have a big cork, and you probably put bread in there or something. And again, stay away from the rocks. But they still make glass ones today, and a lot of times plastic. But it's still the same principle. They go in the hole and they can't get back out. And I just thought that was a lot of
Well, I
fun.
guess we were unsophisticated. We just held a bucket until they got in there and then scooped. And
Hey,
if we were lucky, we got them.
that sounds good. It sounds like it would work. But these are extremely old. Some of these go back to 1850. These are from Teresa, New York, and there's a Rochester and Buffalo and Syracuse, and another one from Syracuse. This guy was a hairdresser. I don't know what he was doing making lures, but so they all have a story behind them. They're kind of interesting. And so then I want to show you if I can find it. Maybe I can't. But I told you about Buell inventing the spoon, and this is an old lure, and it has a 1852 patent date. And I found this in Cortland at a garage sale one day.
Huh.
And really exciting, because this is something you don't see very often. At one time, they were going like $700 just for that. But the market's not what it used to be. But so that's kind of what I've got here. These are local things here. This is an art shaft spoon from Homer, New York, and Art worked at Bosse's and Brewer Kitchener, and he got a stamping machine somehow, and he started making these lures. And they're off center, so they wobble, and he thought they made a lot of sonic noise. So he sold me a couple one time, and I went to Cuba Lake with my friend Jay, and we made like 10 casts and caught 7 fish. And I said, oh my God, these things work. So we went back and bought the company from him. I've got a big stamping machine in my garage right now. I don't know why. But isn't that fun? Here's some old security buttons from Cortland Line, the World War II. To get in to do your work, you had to have this button with your picture on it. We were very serious about that, and with a little research I made, though, to find out who that is. And here's another employee. I think she was there a little too long. She's got a kind
What
of
years did Cortland line exist?
Cortland Line started in 1915, and they had their 100-year anniversary here 4 years ago, which is pretty exciting. But they've had about 5 iterations, and they got a young man who's trying to bring the company back right now.
They still make line in Cortland?
Oh, very much so. A lot of braided line and a lot of fly line. I think they've stopped making the monofilament, but they just stopped that not too many years ago. I worked in the extrusion monofilament department for 15 years, and we were kind of an offshoot of Newton Line Company, which is Hobby International now. Yeah, they're all interconnected, and everyone was very friendly in the old days in fish line. If you were out of something, you'd call your main competitor, and they would just mail it to you the next day and help you out, or this company here would make braid for Cortland, or Cortland would make braid for them. And it was really kind of nice back then. Things weren't as competitive. So.
Yep, they're still on Kellogg Road. I got an email from them last week.
Did you?
Yeah.
I looked at Facebook stuff all the time.
Yeah, no, they're still there. They're plugging away. And we're rooting for them. One thing that was kind of fun I didn't tell you about was, if I can find it, there's a book here called The Colonial Angler, and it talks about fishing in the late 1700s. And of course the fly patterns just look like hackle, and they really didn't even use dry flies. Everything was a wet fly, if you know what I mean. So it would sink in the water. But back then, they had fishing clubs again, and you always fished above the fish. You fished downstream because it was unsporting to fish from behind. If you fished from behind for a fish and they couldn't see you, they would kick you out of the club and you couldn't come back. I mean, there was some sort of code back then. All sorts of things like that. So it was a very different time, you know, especially for the wealthy back then compared to other people. But for the most part, that's kind of what I got to show you. There's a lot of odds and ends. This is a company from Richfield Springs, New York. Kind of near Herkimer, you might say. And they had a huge business, and a lot of different fishing lures. And again, here's some different Cortlands, even some flies there from Dryden, New York. So I guess that's what we got.
Thank you, Tom.
Good, Tom.